Hey y'all, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today I'm going to talk about the question, was I ever trans? Because I've heard this narrative a couple times in regards to detransitioners, where people will say things like, well, you were never really trans, you were just confused the whole time. Like, if you were really trans, then you would have never detransitioned. The fact that you detransitioned proves that you were never really trans. And while there may be some detrans people out there who use that sort of language to talk about their own experiences in terms of, they might say, well, I thought I was trans, but turns out I'm not trans. I'm actually comfortable in my natal sex identity, and sort of may go so far as to even disavow that concept of identity itself and just, proclaim themselves, I was confused, but now I know that I'm comfortable being my natal sex. Um, so, but in my personal, experience, like, I do think that it is appropriate and accurate to say that I was trans and now I'm detrans. And I've also heard people say, like, well, you were never really trans because you didn't have gender dysphoria. You just had like a cross-dressing kink, and you took that cross-dressing kink, you know, so far as to transition and go on hormones for 8 years. But I think that's a rather simplistic interpretation of like what actually happened with my experiences and what caused me to take on a transgender identity for 8 years and take hormones for 8 years. Like, I don't think people do that. And in my case, I certainly did not do that for some, you know, like simple reason. It's a very complicated thing to upend your entire life and identity and, physical, body by, taking on this identity, socially transitioning. I legally changed my name, socially identified, as Rachel, and like created this whole persona around Rachel, and lived that life for 8 years. And to say that I was not really trans, I think for me personally, that's not an accurate statement, because the way I think about it was that my transness was a choice. And when I say my transness was a choice, I need to be careful here, because I'm not saying that the desires that I had that caused me to take on that trans identity, those desires were choices. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the decision to take on that identity label itself was a choice, because 8 years ago, when I was sort of going through my gender crisis, was identifying as just a crossdresser, as a gender non-conforming male. So I was a man. I knew I liked women's clothing. I liked wearing women's clothing. There was an erotic component to this, insofar as like wearing women's clothing, like, aroused me. But there was also a sort of like not purely sexual arousal component. There was an element of just like expressing myself, expressing my femininity in a way that was not like 100%, erotic, but took on a more element of expressing a feminine side of myself through clothing that I found to be comfortable and what, I liked from an aesthetic perspective. So it wasn't like, my interest in women's clothing was, 100% like constantly feeling the feeling of being aroused all the time. It was like, that was like a driving element, and maybe the foundational origin from which those desires and interests came. but it wasn't like from a phenomenological perspective of like how I experienced those desires. Like eventually those desires became subliminated into a expression of comfort that caused me to transition. But at the point of my gender crisis, there was this confusion I had in regards to, well, what am I? Like, I have these desires to basically be a full-time crossdresser. But am I really a crossdresser, or am I trans? And I started doing this research on the internet. I started, reading, stories of other people. I started reading Reddit stories, and I found many other trans people on the internet who had similar stories as mine, like a long history of cross-dressing, and even a history of fetishistic cross-dressing, such that wearing women's clothing would cause arousal. And there was many trans women I found on the internet who shared that exact same history, including the fetishistic arousal, and they identified as trans. So I was like, well, these people have the same experiences as me, the same desires as me, the same, gender experiences, and yet they're trans and they're not just merely cross-dressers. So in that moment, I decided that I am trans, and I decided to take on that identity of being trans, because I could have chosen to continue living as a crossdresser. I could have continued to just keep identifying as a cross-dressing man, as a cross-dressing male. And nothing about that choice would have changed the underlying desires or gender experiences that I had in terms of my interest in women's clothing. Or my interest in taking hormones, or my interest in, trying to live out this life, to express my feminine side. Like, nothing about that choice of identity, that choice of what to call myself, what to label myself, like that wouldn't have changed those underlying desires. And so that's what I'm trying to say here, is that at that point in my life 8 years ago, when I decided to transition, there was like a path in front of me. I could have gone down the crossdresser path, where I continued to identify as a cross-dressing male, or the path I actually took, which is like I took on the identity label of being trans, and once I did that, once I took on that identity label of being trans, like that was not just a incidental decision. Like that decision led to the emergence of more gender dysphoria, because once I took on this trans identity, I started to become, more uncomfortable with my body, and I wanted to pass more and more and more, because I had this desire to cross-dress, but I knew that being just a cross-dresser was not a very socially acceptable thing to do. Just being a man who looks like a man, who everyone can tell is born male, going out and being all feminine, like you kind of get a lot of like weird looks and stares, and there's not really like a lot of social acceptance for feminine cross-dressing males. It's not really like very easy to find success in dating, relationships, social life, work, career, etc., when you're living out this life as a self-identified cross-dressing male, who's wearing feminine clothing, but otherwise going by a male name, using male pronouns, but you're presenting in a feminine way. That kind of creates like a social contrast that's not really well tolerated in our Western society. But I kind of knew at the time, because this is 2015, where the trans tipping point and trans women were a big thing in the media, like Caitlyn Jenner, Laverne Cox, and all these different, trans representation was happening where, it seemed like more socially acceptable to me to be trans than a crossdresser. So, that was part of the decision process that I made at that time was, I have a choice of how to identify myself and express myself in terms of like, what am I? Like, am I a crossdresser or am I trans? Well, I decided that I'm trans because it seemed easier at that time to take on this trans identity, because if I was just a crossdresser, I felt like people would question my motivations and they'd kind of dig into, the fetishistic aspect of that. Whereas if I said I'm trans, I'm going to be valid, nobody's going to question me. I'm just born this way. There's a whole narrative, the born this way narrative that fits into the trans story that I plugged myself into very easily. So now, fast forward 8 years living this life, I decide, it's no longer for me. And I detransitioned. This was about 5 months ago. I got off the hormones, I socially detransitioned. So now I'm, living, and identifying as a man, as a male. I'm, off the hormones, my body's producing testosterone. But all those same desires for cross-dressing, for wearing women's clothing, all that still exists for me. Like, none of that has changed. The only thing that has changed is I made a choice to no longer identify as trans. So now the question is, well, was I ever really trans in the first place? Well, in my opinion, like, when I was living as trans, peak trans, like, nobody questioned my legitimacy. I had the same experience as all these other trans women, the same background, and you can look this up. If you don't believe that having a history of arousal with, thinking of yourself as a woman or thinking of yourself as, expressing some aspect of femininity, like, if like you don't think those things, causing arousal is compatible with like the life history of trans women, just go on Reddit and like search on trans forums. You will see that there are so many trans women who fit into a similar story, and there's research on this too. So like, it's not like I was some like aberration in my story. Like, I wouldn't have taken on the trans identity unless I did my research to know that I was not alone in having those experiences be a driving force or a factor in my life history. Like, I would not have taken on the trans label if I didn't confirm through extensive research that having this history of arousal connected to femininity is compatible with being a quote unquote valid trans woman. It's just a sort of like, what is the origin of dysphoria? Because I've heard a lot of people say that, like, oh, well, you just have AGP, or you're just a crossdresser. You didn't really have gender dysphoria because you didn't really have this disconnect between your body and, your like imagined body. Like that. Some people will try and say like, true gender dysphoria is only about like hating your sexed body. And, that's not really quite accurate, because if you look at the DSM under gender dysphoria, like having dissatisfaction with like your sex body is a part of that, but the origins of where that dysphoria come from, it's like kind of agnostic. And dissatisfaction with your sexed body is only one component of gender dysphoria. There's other components. There's, the social trappings, the clothing, how we express ourselves, like how we're perceived socially, behaviors, and it's more than just the body. Like the body is a big component, but there's more aspects to it than just simply having discontent with your body. And for me, like, I eventually came to have that dysphoria about my body. It's just like, what is the causal origin of that? For me, it started with the clothing, but then like it evolved and got more intense, and the body stuff came later. And if you look at like the DSM, it doesn't say that like the body hatred has to be the foundational element and everything else follows from that. It's like a symptom checklist, but it's not about like the symptoms have to have the proper causal origin to be true gender dysphoria. The symptoms just have to be there regardless of the causal origin. And after I transitioned, after I took on this trans identity, I like all that stuff, eventually developed in my mind such that I kind of like came to have, the sort of like classical dysphoria in regards to disliking, many aspects of my body, my voice, my shoulders, my muscles, my Adam's apple, my facial hair, and like my facial structure and features and all this sort of stuff. Like, so I had all that, dislike of my sexed body. And, there are still aspects of that I, dislike now because, I have this desire for cross-dressing. And when I'm cross-dressing, like the maleness of my body sort of like is undesirable. Now, through a lot of processing and 8 years of transition and living as a trans woman, I came to accept my sexed body, and that was part of the impetus for the detransition, was learning to realize that I can be happy in the full acknowledgement of my maleness, and I can be happy living with the recognition of my maleness and not denying it or trying to hide it in some way. And just sort of like accepting that I can be a gender non-conforming male, but I don't have to live out socially or metaphysically convince myself of anything beyond that. But going back to that kind of core question of like, well, was I ever really trans? And I would sort of say that all these same desires that caused me to want to transition, those desires are still with me today. And I would say transness, the reality of transness, is more about those underlying desires than it is about, the choice of a label that you make, because two people might have the exact same similar desires in regards to these cross gender, elements, experiences, desires, but they might choose to label themselves differently. One person might label themselves, I'm just a gender non-conforming male. Someone else might say I'm non-binary. Someone else might say I'm a trans woman. And they might all have, from the perspective of their desires, they might all have the same exact underlying phenomenological experience of those desires. So for me, the question of like, well, was I really trans? It's kind of like a terminological dispute without substance, because it's about, merely defining words and debating like what words mean. And that's not really the substance of like reality. That's just like labels and words and definitions and semantics. Like for me, the reality is more about like, well, what are my desires? What is like the origin of those desires? And, how do I deal with those desires? Like the desires are the same today as they were when I transitioned 8 years ago. It's just that I'm choosing to deal with them differently because 8 years of transition and living in a trans woman has taught me that there are other ways to deal with these desires in a way that is more, for me personally at least, more physically and psychologically healthy than living life and trying to pass as a trans woman. So I think that's enough for this video. Hopefully, I got the point across. Again, I'm just speaking about my own personal experiences here. Not every detrans person will, relate to what I've said, and I'm not trying to like invalidate anyone's experiences. I'm just, strictly talking about my own experiences, my own interpretation of, my life and my gender and how I'm dealing with it. So thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed that. And thanks.